Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. To my bed crimers, I hope you guys are having a lovely day. To anybody new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out the channel. Do me a favor, if you get something out of the video, smash the like button and subscribe to my channel. Now, let's dig in. What is so sad to me about this case is what a beautiful life the Murdaughs could have had, what could have been, the Camelot that wasn't to be. Alec Murdaugh was born into a prestigious family that some have called a legal dynasty, and he enjoyed all the privileges that came from that. A good education, law school, parents who helped launch him toward success in the family business. Clearly, Alec was a decent personal injury attorney, not a decent man, but a decent attorney. We know he won large awards for his clients because we heard about how much of those monies he kept for himself. Margaret was born to Terry and Kennedy Branstetter and grew up in Pennsylvania. When her father's job relocated the family to South Carolina in 1987, Margaret enrolled at the University of South Carolina. That's where she crossed paths with her future husband, Alec Murdaugh. Margaret was a member of the Kappa Delta sorority there, and she graduated in 1991. Alec and Margaret married in Charleston, South Carolina in 1993 and went on to have two sons, Buster and Paul. Margaret then became, except for a short stint as a co-owner of a boutique with her mother-in-law, Miss Libby, a stay-at-home mom, a privilege many parents don't have. Margaret has been described as being a devoted mother to her boys, and that includes Buster, Paul, and Alec Murdaugh. The family divided their time between two homes, the vast 1,772-acre Moselle Hunting Lodge in Islandton, South Carolina, which is currently valued at $3.9 million, and the cozy four-bedroom beach cottage near the waterfront at Edisto Beach, valued at $920,000. As hunters, fishermen, and all-around men's men, Alec and Paul must have viewed Moselle as a sort of playground. There, wild turkeys, pigs, doves, and deer roamed, which made for good hunting. It's unclear to me if Buster was as infatuated with Moselle as his younger brother Paul was. Margaret, who her sister Marion described as more of a girly girl type as opposed to a tomboy, preferred the beach house over Moselle, especially during the summer months. The family also had help with the upkeep of their properties. First came housekeeper and nanny Gloria Satterfield, who for 24 years assisted in the rearing of Buster and Paul, and handled the housekeeping. In fact, Satterfield lost her life after sustaining a serious tumble down the brick stairs leading to Moselle's front door. Next came Blanca Terubiat Simpson, who was hired to assist Margaret with cleaning and cooking, and who became a close confidant of Mrs. Murdaugh. The Murdaughs also hired a neighbor to take care of their dogs and dog kennels. That job meant heading to Moselle twice a day to feed the dogs and clean out the kennels. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The family was prosperous, at least compared to most people. Sadly, we now know there were cracks in the foundation. Margaret had hired a forensic accountant, unbeknownst to Alec, before her death to go over the family's monies. This shows she was concerned about finances and didn't feel Alec was keeping her in the loop. Margaret was also living pretty much full-time at the beach house. Alec had to request that she come to Moselle on the night of her death. And then there's her wedding ring being found by Blanca Simpson under the seat of her new Mercedes. And what about the receipt that SLED agents found tossed in the family's garbage? An item costing more than $1,000 from Gucci was circled. Who circled that item? Was there a discussion between husband and wife about it? All of these things hint that there was trouble in paradise. As I consider all of this, it strikes me that if only Alec Murdaugh had not been stealing from his clients and firm, if only he didn't have a 20-year-long opioid addiction, if only he'd never cheated on Margaret that one time 15 years earlier, if only Paul had not been enabled to drink alcohol as a minor, and while piloting the family boat in 2019, leading to the tragic and senseless death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach. If only all these things hadn't happened, the Murdaughs of Moselle maybe could have had a lovely, even enviable life. But that's a lot of if-onlys, and it's all just wishful thinking now. Alec Murdaugh was found to be stealing money from clients and his firm as far back as 2011. By the time all was said and done, Alec had, according to the law firm, embezzled $8.4 million from numerous victims, including friends, associates, former law partners, and his clients. And Alec's money misdeeds may even precede that. Reporter John Monk of the state newspaper wrote this, and I quote, "A June 3rd court filing says Murdaugh's life of debt and loans could date back to 2005, the year that some say his secret life of juggling various in-and-out revenue streams began," end quote. I'm still wondering why Alec Murdaugh started stealing money in the first place. We know he was making big bucks as a personal injury attorney. Why weren't those monies adequate? Did Alec steal because he and Margaret could not really afford the life they were living? The 2 high-end properties, the new Mercedes, the European vacations, Buster's law school education, and the legal fees from Paul's boat crash. Was Alec stealing only because of his opioid addiction, or did he have other addictions as well? Perhaps gambling. I don't know. I'm wondering. His defense attorney, Jim Griffin, told the jury on Wednesday that Alec was buying $50,000 of drugs a week from his dealer who owed money to a local cowboy gang because of Alec's purchases. Could Alec himself have consumed $50,000 worth of opioids a week all by himself? That seems excessive. Griffin mentioned that $50,000 a week drug habit as he grilled SLED special agent David Owen during cross-examination about why the gang members who supplied the drugs to Alec's cousin Eddie weren't treated as prime suspects in Paul and Margaret's deaths. The defense continues to try and plant reasonable doubt in the jurors' mind about whether Alec Murdaugh is the person who harmed Paul and Margaret. Griffin's statements about Alec's drug spending is supported by Monk's article, in which he wrote that Alec was secretly writing hundreds of thousands of dollars in checks to a distant cousin named Curtis Eddie Smith, a disabled logger who's facing drug and financial fraud charges, end quote. Smith, or Cousin Eddie, as he's come to be known during the trial, is the guy that Alec hired to do him in on the side of a rural road so that Buster could inherit $10 million in insurance monies, and to also try and persuade people that his family was truly being targeted. According to Monk's article, Alec was facing recurring cycles of unceasing debts, high spending, bank overdrafts, taking out loans, paying them off, and getting new ones for many, many years. And we know that Alec was also a defendant in that wrongful death lawsuit over Paul's 2019 fatal accident involving Alec's boat, with not enough insurance coverage to cover a possible large verdict against the family. If the Murdaughs had even greater wealth, maybe $30 million or more in the bank, would Paul and Margaret still be alive? Did they die simply because of money issues? If there was enough cash to pay the boat crash victims for their pain and suffering, and to pay Mallory Beach's parents a large sum to try and make up for their great loss, the loss of their daughter, would Paul and Margaret still be breathing? I'm just wondering. I fear that we're never really going to know. Today, Thursday, February 16th, 2023, the jurors in Alec Murdaugh's trial were told about the injuries that Paul and Margaret sustained from the point of view of Dr. Kenny Kinsey, the chief deputy of the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office and a crime scene investigator. Dr. Kinsey discussed where Paul and Margaret were shot, not only in terms of where on their body, but also in terms of where they were standing when they were shot, and where the shooter was positioned while he was shooting at them. Dr. Kinsey told the jury that Paul was initially struck by a non-fatal shot to his chest with buckshot. Buckshot, as Dr. Kinsey explained, has a lot fewer pellets than birdshot, but the pellets are larger. Buckshot is used to take down large game. The 9 or so pellets from the buckshot struck Paul's chest and arm, and then exited through the rear window of the feed room. That's why there were holes in that rear glass window. So I was wrong when I was speculating that the shooter was shooting from outside the feed room through the glass window. Instead, the shooter was in front of the feed room, shooting into the feed room. Dr. Kinsey said that Paul was standing about halfway inside the feed room, perhaps 5 feet, when he sustained the first shot. Per Kinsey, Paul's arms were not up at the time, so Paul was not in defensive mode, and he was likely caught off guard by the shooter. Dr. Kinsey also stated that Paul remained standing for a period after that first shot in the feed room, and he knows this because of the shape and location of blood drops on the floor. A trail of Paul's blood drops led to the feed room's door. According to Dr. Kinsey, Paul was walking after the first shot, but it was very slow walking. Kinsey explained that Paul was likely in a lot of pain from those burning pellets, and his left shoulder was probably slumped down. That's where all the injuries were. Kinsey believes Paul was in pain because of the slow pace at which he walked toward the door. Because Paul was only 22, if he hadn't been in a lot of pain, he would have gotten to that door much quicker. As for where the shooter was standing when he shot Paul that first time, Dr. Kinsey said it was impossible to know the shooter's exact position. However, the shotgun was definitely inside the feed room door, and he knows this because the spent shotgun cartridges were on the floor inside the feed room. If the shotgun had been fully outside the feed room, the cartridges would have been on the ground outside. Now I'm thinking that if Paul was able to walk to the door, he must have had awareness, at least for a split second or two, of who shot him. If Alec Murdaugh did this, it's hard to imagine the betrayal and astonishment Paul would have felt. Dr. Kinsey made it clear that Paul could not have self-harmed in this manner. Per Dr. Kinsey, as Paul made that slow walk to the door, he was likely hunched to the one side with his wounded arm. It's so sad. Even if Paul is responsible for the boat crash, he didn't deserve to have his life taken away from him at age 22, and certainly not in this brutal manner. As for Paul's second wound, this was the one that was fatal. According to Dr. Kinsey, Paul was standing near the doorframe to the feed room when he sustained this shot. His left shoulder would have still been slumped down, and that shoulder would have been past the doorframe, meaning outside the feed room. Per Dr. Kinsey, the shooter was standing maybe 3 to 4 feet outside the feed room to the right of the doorway when he shot Paul this second time. Paul immediately fell face forward out of the doorframe to the ground, with his feet still in the doorframe. He fell slightly to the right. You can see the exact position in the diagram. Paul died instantly because the second shot went in a straight line through his body, to his jaw, and through the back of his head. This was the catastrophic shot that sent the young man's brain flying out of his skull. Paul died instantly. The shooter used birdshot for the second wound. Birdshot differs from buckshot in that it contains about 100 to 156 smaller pellets, so it has a lot more pellets than buckshot. Birdshot is designed to bring down winged creatures, rabbits, dove, quail, and duck. Ironically, the birdshot, although it had smaller but many more pellets than the buckshot, is what proved fatal to Paul. I'm sorry, but what was done to Paul and Margaret seems equally as gruesome as what was inflicted on the 4 University of Idaho students. If suspect Brian Kohberger is found guilty of that crime and the death penalty is metered out to him, then it seems like the perpetrator of this horrid crime in South Carolina should get the same. I'm just as horrified by what happened to Paul and Margaret as I am by what happened to Kaylee, Madison, Ethan, and Xana. But the prosecutors in South Carolina are not seeking the death penalty against Murdaugh. Moving on to Margaret's injuries. According to Dr. Kinsey, Margaret sustained 3 non-fatal injuries first. One was to her wrist, one was to her upper left thigh just above her knee, and one was to her abdomen. This third one exited somewhere around her kidneys. Margaret would have stood for a while, perhaps while bent over, holding her abdomen, but then she fell to her knees and had one hand on the ground supporting her. Dr. Kinsey knew Margaret stood for a little bit because she had blood dripping down her leg. She also had gunshot stippling, which indicates the shooter was at close range when he pulled the trigger. Margaret's last 2 shots were each fatal wounds. The first one, which is the one that killed her, was to her left side. It entered through the lower part of her breast and did extensive damage. It then entered her jaw and finally went up into her brain. At that point, Margaret slumped fully to the ground. But the shooter wasn't done. At that point, he walked up to her and he placed the rifle's barrel straight down at the top of her head and shot. Dr. Kinsey believes that the order of the shots, as I've just described them, is the same order in which they were dealt out to Margaret. To me, that second fatal shot seems like overkill and seems like rage. Strangely, there was also a mark on the back of Margaret's leg that Dr. Kinsey attributed to a tire tread from the ATV parked nearby her body, but he said that Maggie was not run over by the tire. It sounds like the inside of her calf somehow came in contact with that tire. How that happened, nobody seems to know. Both Paul and Margaret's injuries tell me that whoever killed them wanted to be 100% sure they were dead. What's interesting is that in the police body cam footage from when the first officers arrived at the crime scene near the dog kennels at Moselle, Alec Murdaugh is seen asking twice if it's official that Paul and Margaret are dead. Take a listen.
Somebody going to check them?
Yes, sir. They've already checked them.
They did check them?
Yes, sir.
This is official that they're dead?
Yes, sir. That's what it looks like.
I'm sorry.
No.
Did you hear that? Alec asks the officer, is somebody going to check them? The officer responds, they already have. And that's what it looks like, meaning it looks like, yes, they're dead. Was that Alec seeking official verification, wanting to be sure that he had achieved his goal? The way Alec asked that question didn't sound like a family member wanting to hear that his wife and son were still alive. To me, it was more like he was looking for confirmation that they were dead. Now, let's talk about why Alec Murdaugh might have committed this heinous crime. Let's assume for a second that he's found guilty and really is the perpetrator. Why did he take both Paul and Margaret's lives? He could, after all, have done in just Paul. Paul was responsible for the fatal boat crash that led to Mallory Beach's death and to the lawsuits that were threatening to ruin the Murdaughs financially and expose Alec's financial crimes. Margaret was actually staying at the Edisto beach house at the time, and Paul had been couch surfing for weeks, so he wasn't really living at Moselle full-time either. Alec specifically asked Margaret and Paul to come to Moselle on the night of June 7th, 2021. We can surmise that Alec wanted Paul out of the picture because of the financial fallout from the boat crash that was threatening to expose all of his crimes. But why did Alec want Margaret gone? I've been wondering if it was triggered by Margaret ordering a forensic accounting of the family's financial affairs. Reporter Matt Harris, a morning show host on WLNK and the host of the podcast The Murdaugh Family Murders: Impact of Influence, made that stunning announcement in September of 2021 on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace. Harris said that he got it from, and I quote, a pretty reliable source, that Margaret had hired a forensic accountant. Did Alec know about that? Also, according to ABC4 News, 6 weeks prior to her death, Margaret met with a divorce lawyer in Charleston. Did Alec find out that she was considering divorce? There are also rumors that Alec may have been having an affair. Did Margaret find out, and did she confront Alec? We know from Margaret's sister, Marion Proctor, that 15 years prior to her death, Margaret kicked Alec out of their home because she discovered he was having an affair. Proctor said that it was still a sore point in Margaret and Alec's marriage. Mrs. Proctor went on to say that her sister had brought up the affair just prior to being murdered. We know that detectives, searching the crime scene after the murders, found a receipt in the Murdaughs' garbage with one item circled on it. That item was a $1,021 purse from the luxury brand Gucci. It was circled as if someone had discovered the receipt and confronted the buyer about the pricey purchase. Did Margaret confront Alec about it? Had he bought it for another woman? Any one of these things would have likely upset Alec. Alec was already having financial difficulties. He literally could not afford more costly problems. Getting divorced would likely have led to alimony and spousal payments, perhaps even force the family to sell Moselle and the beach cottage. When Margaret's sister Marion was on the stand, she told the jury that Margaret called her son Paul her little detective. Was Paul the person who discovered the receipt with the pricey Gucci item on it? Did he show his mom? And did that lead to Alec being exposed as a cheater once again? Buster was not asked to come to Moselle that night. Why was Buster spared? I'm trying to understand Alec's rationale if he is responsible for his wife and son's deaths. But maybe I'm thinking too hard. Alec claims he had a serious opioid addiction for 20 years. Was that addiction so strong and unrelenting that it made Alec lose all rationality? Did Alec's self-confessed 50 grand a week addiction make him snap and temporarily lose all judgment? I feel like there's so much more to this story than has been shared with the jurors. By the way, the judge allowed testimony about Alec Murdaugh's shooting incident on the side of the road several months after the murders, when he hired a distant cousin, Cousin Eddie, to shoot and kill him in a bid to gain $10 million in insurance monies for his remaining son, Buster. Originally, the judge said he was not going to allow testimony about that crazy event. However, he changed his mind when one of Alec's defense attorneys questioned Marion Proctor, and she stated that her feelings about Paul and Margaret's murders changed when she learned of Alec's roadside murder-for-hire plot. With this additional testimony, the trial, which was originally supposed to end this week or next, will likely continue for 2 more weeks. By the way, Buster Murdaugh apparently hugged his Aunt Marion after she testified at his father's trial. That's a good thing to see. Buster maybe will come to view Marion as a surrogate mom. She looks so much like her deceased sister Margaret, and she came across as such a kind woman on the stand. Buster needs loving family around him, no matter what. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, hey, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, leave me a comment, and I'll see you next time.